A Theory of the Internet as Religious System. Notes on Cosmology, Information, and Emerging Discursive Textures. Cosmology can be read as a metaphor for our relation to the infinite. In this sense, various models have had theological implications. Geocentrism, sprawling over 1500 years of the Christian era, was a perfect model for that time, in which truth, represented by the sun, was subordinate to the representational strategies of religion, and its mystical frameworks assumed the power of ultimate or divine validity. Heliocentrism, coinciding with the American colonial encounter, an encounter that was only possible as a challenge to the geographic and cosmological models of the Church, and which discredited them to make way eventually for the Copernican model. Heliocentrism, which subordinates human activity to the sun or truth, was in turn a perfect model for the positivist age, whose mode was science and whose quantitative disease of capital reached divine perfection. The new cosmological model that proposes a black hole at the center of not just our galaxy, but most galaxies in the universe, represents a new metaphorical relation to infinity that corresponds to a new theology I would like to focus in the Internet, which may be read as a religious system equipped with a specific epistemology that challenges and relates parasitically to the truth model at the end of the Christian era. The character of a black hole, which includes the variety of ways it can be understood, is very important to the system of meaning it has spawned. The precise behavior of these objects eludes us and is impossible to obtain, as the conditions in their center are such that the force of gravity, or curvature of space-time, becomes infinite, while volume becomes zero, values that exclude equations for physical reality. This problematic interaction with infinity pushes physics ever further into experimental suggestions, none of which have obtained the value of truth, but which do represent the sum of information associated with the black hole, from which a multifarious portrait of a sort of jack-of-all-trades can be consumed. The black hole, in other words, is the limit of the positivist discourse developed in the heliocentric era, and past its point, the tactics of objectivity produce a form of meaning so diffuse and colorful, they lead in aggregate to a mockery of the system they issue from. It is as if this discourse, which alone is powerful enough to project the understanding into the center of our galaxy, glimpsed its death and began to act like a fool. Some of the ostentatious and deranged theories that swim around the paradoxes of the black hole include the following: that each black hole is attached to a white hole, so that the matter falling into the object that can only be entered travels out of the object that can only be exited, giving way to the idea that the Big Bang was a white hole, and that now the observable universe is the interior of a black hole, this absorption-expulsion continuing indefinitely for the production of multiple universes. That the problem of zero volume can be solved with recourse to string theory, which states that any point in spacetime contains extensive dimensions organized as a manifold, through which the missing value can be extracted from various lower dimensional sources. That black holes shrink through the emission of special radiation, so that one with the mass of a car would have a diameter of about 10 to the negative 24th meters, many times smaller than an electron, and take a nanosecond to evaporate, during which time it would briefly have a luminosity more than 200 times that of the sun. The range of these ideas destroys the possibility of an identity, though they are gathered toward the formation of its ideal, as if the process were rewound and presented as more or less complete in a state of chaos. The field of experimental physics, where the more research gets done, the more ideas are produced, the more intense this chaos becomes, a seeming regression from the ideal of an essential and verifiable state, assumes the character of information in general today, where nothing is verifiable because the internet proliferates endless speculation in an infinite domain. That is, the form of the discourse of physics, contaminated by the infinity of the black hole, beyond which point its content cannot travel, has reincarnated as the form of information rendered by the epistemological example of the black hole, whose analogous interface is the screen. The standard of meaning black holes have set is the counter-ideal, which siphons the energy needed to achieve the goal of its discourse, in the case of physics, scientific validity, and sabotages this process before it can finalize that state. The ideal is preserved as a motivating force, but is prevented from inhabiting reality. An example from the screen would be post-truth, which requires truth in its animating conceptual form with the attendant passion of liberal anger, but prevents its codification as an actual account of Trump's behavior, sabotaging this process through the proliferation of claims. The counter-ideal is counter and not oppositional or destructive, because it must sleep with the enemy, as it were, whose power is necessary for it to render itself. Truth, on the other hand, is essentially combative. It emerges from flux like a champion. This quality derives from the conditions of life at the dawn of writing in early Mesopotamia, when perpetual border wars drew the activity into military accounts, the aim of which was to authorize each state's claim to universal dominion, the only force that could legitimate their historical impulse. Many of these accounts end, like Hammurabi's code, with long curses on any who erase their names or records, which suggests that it was common practice to destroy the records of the vanquished, effectively singularizing the champion's military truth claim. The need to emerge from a state of equalization can also be seen in the Iliad, the inaugural poem of our literature, remarkable as an account of war because the armies are made not of the underclass, but of kings and princes, all of whom were equals on the battlefield and can only distinguish themselves by glorious slaughter. Curiously, because of the poetic dilation of time and the ornate manners of the warriors, battle in the Iliad often appears like a dance, a medium whose beauty is its assertion that the curtailment of one to the other is unnecessary. In this way, the poem depicts many counter-ideals, and even if it destroys them eventually to depict glory, it does not hide them in a compact singular state. If one were to read the Iliad backwards, one would catch the shift in thought that characterizes the present, where the outcome of battles to produce meaning now land in regressed pluralities, whose sole antagonism is to remove the possibility of glory. Of course, this is not a neutral act. The removal of glory from the discourse of truth breaks the tool that invests its products with meaning, as if you could travel to the end of an equation and find nothing there. This missing singularity corresponds to the absence of the black hole's singularity, a transitional term between positivism and our current discourse. Using the tactics of the counter-ideal, if we were to hitch a ride on an imaginary observer whose desire for understanding carried him past the event horizon, where information is lost and meaning breaks down, we could rewind to the region immediately around the black hole, which is what we're able to see in the few images we produced of them. This region, called the accretion disk, is full of matter spun incredibly fast, that gives off mostly X-ray radiation, some of it falling into the hole and some of it kept in orbit. It is this radiant plurality bent into a circle around the gravitational nothingness of the shadow that allows us to see in outline what is effectively not there. But at the same time, this mix of what is visible and what is invisible is precisely what is there. When we look into the sun, we look into its singular might, the mental operation of truth. When we look into the black hole, the mental operation we see is association. The faculty of association is infinite and void. Its force of attraction, its gravity we might say, is endless, touching everything randomly, pulling, gathering, while association itself is nothing, has no volume, is not an object. It joins things, but doesn't relinquish its negative space. Literary styles that depict association, such as stream of consciousness, give the misleading impression that such copiousness is seamless, as if it were paranoid of falling into the void that is its connective tissue. The physical phenomenon of nothingness that holds its associational orbit of matter in place is profoundly suggestive of other representational strategies that depict this thought process. Earlier, I said that the black hole's analogous interface is the screen. Is it too much to suggest that our screens are association as objects, whose force of attraction is infinite and whose volume as surfaces is zero, and that render from these conditions radiant pluralities of information that are, in their nature, destined to sabotage truth and remain plural in accordance with our new theological demands? While these demands are complex and specific to our time, they are not unprecedented. The religious form of the internet is polytheism. With this view, the historical movement of faith appears wavilinear. It may be a very slow wave, but its change is regular. Before the ascendance of monotheism, belief displayed an infinite capacity for gods. Christianity reduced this capacity to a trinity balanced on a point, and in its positivist age, the age of secularization, the value of God became zero. Today online, there are again unlimited deities. But I must be upfront and explain what I mean by God. A God is a narrative device, or a God is a vector for significance. The zero value of God in the positivist age, whose narrative style is realism. I'm sorry, I lost my place. The zero value of God in the positivist age, whose narrative style is realism, appears as the absence of God as a tool necessary for the construction of its stories. Realism is the quintessence of this independence. By contrast, gods are absolutely necessary to the progression of the Iliad. Characters would die and shorten the poem if favoring deities did not appear, at the speed of thought, to tip arrows away from their ribs. One might say the narrative demands of polytheistic literature push the number of gods past limit, not just to make sure they have room to move, but to detoxify the concept of infinity. In Scripture it is said that God can number the stars of night and the grains of sand. It was the prerogative of this divine understanding to contact the numberless and quantify it, to disable endlessness. The irony of the age we are emerging from, which declared it had no use for God, is that when it struck infinity with its magnificent number tale, it no longer had the narrative tool it needed to perpetuate that story. The immediate flaw in my connection between black holes and screens should now be cleared. The difference between the zero display of black holes and the total display of screens occurs because positivism, allergic to infinity, is unable to render it as an image, while screens, under the influence of polytheism, take infinity for granted as the origin of narrative, and resolve it into our endless stream of images. But what, if a God is a narrative device, is the narrative of the internet, where the value of God is swung back to infinity? It would follow that anyone online is a member of the faithful, but in what do we believe? The answer may seem unstable, and while a complete transcript of anyone's internet history, including their points of extraction by big data gatherers, and the use to which this data is put, would offer a very deep archive from which to construct a picture of faith, it may be simpler to say that we all believe in counter-ideals. We are defenders of plurality. At any given time, how many tabs do we have open? What is this information telling us? Are we to read across the bars summarizing the message of each tab? Or are we to open them and randomly, sortus Virgilianae, select a word, phrase, image, video, and from this associated mass develop another statement? Or simply leave that mass intact, globular, shimmering, matte, oily, sweet, iridescent as a bubble, or vitreous, brittle and dangerous to break? I believe we worship the freedom to take any of these paths toward meaning, and the tendency of this worship is comic. We are mad for laughter, the only expression monotheistic divinity, even when human, did not perform. Jesus wept, but he didn't laugh. The Bible has absurd passages, such as the end of Job, but won't permit itself to be read as such. In contrast, the internet is structured by the absurd. Our wager of faith is not that God exists, but that absurdity is a system. The behavior of the system consists in the variety of things that take on narrative momentum. It will be said that many of these strange creatures are fake, shallow, narcissistic aberrations of a decadent era, all of which is fine. The wise among us will extend tolerance not to the freaks that populate our menageries, but to the invalidating jeers, which assume the quality of verification, as they correctly label the freaks unideal. I follow a guy who's famous for having a really long neck. The clout machine of Instagram provides scaffolding for his prank videos and the gold-digging romance that has produced his sickly son. He might have been a suicide before the internet, but now there's something to him, something meaningful beyond his deformity, by no means ideal, but something to follow nonetheless. As a lover and a father, he is probably incompetent, but I see him acting, and I believe. Not that he'll overcome his body and lead a normal life. I simply believe in the associational stream of his activity. I refuse to pity him, and it wouldn't be right to say I tolerate him, because tolerance is a peripheralizing force, and who am I to claim centrality or authority on the web? Long neck is just a god I follow, nothing more. Though I do sacrifice certain ideals to worship him: beauty, fatherhood, romance. If these are the motivating forces that allow him to gather data for his ugly, bastardized, loveless spectacle, then in the accretion disk of his narrative, the ideals would be infalling matter that disappear on contact with singularity. In our previous discourse, they would repose upon that eminence and exclude most of the information about long neck, which would have been eliminated in the battle for their ideality. In our new model, they are foiled by this aspiration for oneness. Longneck rides his ideals into significance and then allows them to fall, with their own velocity, into the uninhabitable position they formerly held. If he becomes too much of a thing, he too will fall in, and then his entire project will be associated towards something else, which is the path attention takes in this age, where nothing stays in the news for very long, no matter how politically, sentimentally, historically, or otherwisely charged, because the center is not stable. It is an infinite curvature where truth gives way to association. The black hole or screen is then a kind of altar. We sacrifice ideals and anything that becomes a center of attention in order to produce plurality. While centers of attention rarely return, ideals are immortal because they are immaterial and can withstand the rapid interplay of items in the dance, or what they may call the battle, of association. Still, the concept of sacrifice seems savage. In the heliocentric era, which began with colonial encounter, a great effort was expended by the Church to disentangle the sacrament from indigenous forms of human sacrifice encountered in the Maya. A surface reading of this effort gives the universal law that all people perpetuate their symbolic order with some form of sacrifice. The savagery of human sacrifice as the Maya did it was avoided through theological niceties, only to reappear on a massive scale as transatlantic slavery, followed by mass incarceration, the former a perpetuation of the symbolic order of capital, and the latter a perpetuation of the symbolic order of justice, both of which can be grouped under the organizational criterion of race. To the extent that we are now sacrificing ideals and longer forms of attention, which produces in many strong feelings of disillusionment and waywardness, it seems we have created a path away from the massive carnage of targeted human sacrifice. And yet this path appears on the edge of climate catastrophe, which should be read as the sacrifice of all human life for the perpetuation of the symbolic order of neoliberalism. I hope it is clear that our current discourse is distinct from neoliberalism, but to drive that home, I will point out that no symbolic order exists or can exist without falling into the black hole screen and becoming associated towards something else. That is, no unifying idea can exist except as plurality, and the only way to stabilize such a thing would be to sacrifice it again and again for the creation of other pluralities, from which its system would have to be reconstituted and not kept. The cyclical nature of this process is exhausting, and many of us feel drained by the internet. Those who don't are seen as priests, for example, Drain Gang. But it would be wrong to say that our efforts are Sisyphean. We have produced the counter-ideal of climate change, whose ideal is neoliberalism, the power responsible for the internet. The nature of this relationship is not a cause for despair. The associated mass of ideas that make up climate change depends on the information matrix neoliberalism has produced, and this subordinated position, though seemingly weak and scattered, is stabler in the long term. For there can be no ascension of climate change to the ideal. We would risk losing its proper character as a choreography of data. It must stay spun and entangled with its motivating bellicose force. The ideal of neoliberalism is doomed to fall in forever, doomed to a life of death. It is up to us to rewind to the point of mixture and read the information of the counter-ideal of climate change, which alone can project human life into the future, and dismiss what we know is fated for singularity, while accepting that which remains plural. Gods. In the interest of my polemic, I dealt hastily with concepts that make up the ostensible argument of this piece, that the internet is a religious system. I will now consider them in greater detail, though I am anxious for you to keep my moral outcry. We are anything but disinterested. The plurality of gods online extends much further than our overabundance of celebrities, niche, micro, or macro, regardless of the amount of attention these greater deities command. If a god is a narrative device, our applications of conveyance are also divine. Messenger, SMS, messages, WhatsApp, Signal, Kik, etc. These streams of text and image allow us to relate at the speed of thought, which generates a much greater social mesh than our previous forms of communication. Moreover, action at the speed of thought was a Homeric device for differentiating gods that otherwise appeared and emoted like humans. So it follows that each one of us, casually appropriating that ability of old polytheistic deities, are also in some sense divine. The image this conjures, of billions of gods swimming in the infinite speed of omnidirectional rivers, themselves also divine, also beings, is exactly as extravagant as our conception of current theology should be. Of course, profligate application of divinity does cheapen it. There can be no absolute. But in this spread, the meaning of God does not become zero. Rather, the concept of equivalence burgeons many forms of association that weren't possible in the system characterized by a belief in the absolute. One of the first declarations of the Bible is a hierarchical relation between humans and nature. The consequences of these words do not need description, though they may benefit from a reformatting. It is enough to say that this hierarchy destroyed countless narratives of association between humans and nature, and subjugated what examples of these monotheists would eventually encounter through imperial expansion as myth. Myths are stories that grow from the principle of equivalence encoded in polytheism, which, as stated earlier, takes infinity as the fundament of narrative. Certainly hierarchies form in the course of many myths, but they do not form in such a way that can be traced back to a primary prescription of equivalence as a condition of meaning. I apologize for my further use of the term association. In the foregone section, I used it in the sense of the mental operation. Here I am using it in its social sense. Who one deals with is around. It is still a term of interaction, but it is more horizontal here than constructive. The mythic principle of equivalence, of the lateralization of items, appears in the internet term lore, a nerdy parody of higher systemic learning. Gatherers of lore are losers in the sense of being unable to project their learning into the future with a rule of perspective that will diminish its point to an essential, valuable truth. The compositional futurity of lore is an image without perspective, perhaps without shadow, like the Prince of Hokusai, many of which eschew these rules in favor of other harmonies. Lateral knowledge, a counter-ideal of specialization, appears dilettantish and non-progressive. Even interdisciplinarians in the academy seem overstretched. How possible is it, after committing to fields outside one's expertise, to remain objective? While objectivity certainly isn't the goal of such an approach, vague heretical accusations float in. What could motivate conceptual promiscuity? A useful example may be Leonardo da Vinci, whom we would never dare call interdisciplinary. The mediocrity of this term is too much. He is a polymath, a Renaissance man, but his scientific efforts were rather mythical in their display of amicability between disparate data. He believed the circulation of waters under the earth analogous to the human circulatory system. And why? It was an act of faith that led to the staggering totality of his portraiture, in which anatomical, geological, and atmospheric detail are rendered with the same level of empathy. In Virgin and Child with St. Anne, the rock under the Virgin's feet is as moving as her face, and both are as moving as the blue crags in the distance. They know each other, they are ensouled, and they reach out to us as we reach out to those we love in a silent choreography that may be motionless. While conceptual association rarely attains this love, Virgin and Child suggest how a priority of friendship between states of understanding can produce feelings of confidence and place in the world. Intuitively, we understand this potential. We understand it in the form of desire that leads us to overstretch ourselves in worship of each other. Online, there is a continuous flurry of terms for the narratives that this worship produces. Many of them are scathing. Fuckboy, love bomb, gaslight, red flag, ghost, situationship, flex, flop, redemption. But in their critical force, they reveal, negatively, the hope that led to investment in the first place. As we are incapable of functioning without multiple narratives flung by permutations of faith, hope, love, even on small, ironically self-protecting, bathetic scales, we have produced the polytheistic sprawl of parasocial attention. Joys and omens abound, often without clear boundaries, which is how life is. We return again and again to the altar. The term parasocial is a descriptive effort not only to widen concepts of interaction, but kinds of being. While critiques of parasociality are right to lament its potential for objectification, they miss the way in which objectification brings non-humanity into the scope of human relation. The price of this expansion is estrangement, certainly, but in order to decenter human life on a scale that will adequately bring the being of all other existence into our concern, which is imperative, we must submit to seismic interpersonal shifts. The divinity of our rivers of communication, our messaging apps, would be the positive end of this shift. My apologies for returning to the Iliad, in which the river Xanthus, disturbed by the hero Achilles' carnage, rises up and battles him with waves. The river interrupts the enterprise of war. There was a degree of fear and respect that went into this passage that is absent from our incessant pollution of water. Imagine the Mississippi rising up to kill the owners, heroes, of chemical plants. Frightening. We need that fear. It is a salutary religious effect. Imagine the Mississippi rising up to kill the owners, heroes of chemical plants. Frightening. We need that fear. It is a salutary religious effect. It is no surprise that ecological stewardship, with blips for shipbuilding and the desertification of the Sahara, coincides with old polytheism. The modern science of ecology echoes the complexity of that ancient knowledge and outstrips it in many ways because of its specialization. The channels of lateral interaction between fields of knowledge that would be vectors for the integration of ecology into our lives are blocked by specialization, whose compositional ethic, as I said before, is perspective, a movement toward the horizon, a progress narrative. No such vision of understanding existed globally prior to monotheism. The internet is a paragon of lateral information when it is coded humorous or outrageous, as these affects don't aspire to the understanding coveted by institutional knowledge. If there exists a mechanism for the spread of salvational information, and ecology is a salvation narrative, that mechanism would be memes and spicy media. The alt-right understood this. Trump was its genius. The framework would have to be retrofitted, but I insist that it is there. Image as a counter-ideal of text. A further significance of Leonardo's studies is their subordination to aesthetics. Images are lateral forms. The information they encode is spread on a single plane, which accounts for their elasticity of meaning, since all parts of a composition can be read as if there were no hierarchy between them. The adage, "a picture's worth 1,000 words," is valuable especially if we assume that even these 1,000 words will not be exhaustive, that it is really impossible to define an image because images break definition. The old painter's desire to depict lateral relations between earth, air, and body would be analogous to a contemporary effort to depict the internet as a single being, a benevolent being, not a demon. Images are tightly bound associations, sometimes incredibly dense, which force the understanding into a form of analysis that is extremely broad and extremely fast, synthesizing its immediately perceivable mass of ideas, the mood of the viewer, and the vibes that bounce out of regions rendered by these items. A portrait of the internet that would be as kind and as enigmatic as the Mona Lisa would require a compositional approach guided by religious awe. Imagining the interaction of the fields of knowledge impulsive toward that vision brings nothing less than an orgy to mind. I digress. The undefinable polysemy of images makes them counter-ideals of words, which are forced by our previous discourse to emerge from flux and grasp a definition for effective use. However, this conception of language always had its counter-ideal in poetry, to the extent that poets are masters of language, who yet rely on a maximum association that defers the glorious singularity of verbal constructions, sometimes indefinitely. A poet is someone who possesses an asymptotic relation to truth. The poetic expansion of significant possibility has taken shape in the rise of images through memes, which began with blocky top-text, bottom-text forms, where words assume their most ribald, sensuous shape, really fucking the image, though it was copulation as transition, as regression toward the plurality of meaning images purely suggest, to the point where today, an image that is virtually inscrutable, illegible, and presented with no caption can become significant to thousands of people within minutes of being shared. The proliferation of memes is a sign that human understanding is returning to the centrality of association, and that people regularly relate to infinity as an energy source for meaning, which is increasingly in a lateral state. It seems to me that many poems now are ridden with pictures, though it would be as unfair to say that poetic meaning has abandoned language as it would be inaccurate to the discursive behavior of counter-ideals, which must remain entangled with their complement. The interaction between image and word is more like a mutation, and perhaps from the grammatical performance of images, ballet, getting light, waltzing, square dance, alcoholism, a new grammar, new grammars, will affect language toward alternative forms. Rap is the region of language most susceptible to this influence. God bless. While the idea that language might be susceptible to new forms of organization over a fairly short period may seem speculative, the arrival of memes was only possible in a discourse characterized by the susceptibility of knowledge in general to new organizational impulses. One of the greatest strengths of memes is their ability to take the point of view of anything, period. The notion that all things have a point of view one can assume by artifice extends the anthropocentric mapping of human systems and habits to infinity, at which point the conditions of meaning that held up these systems collapses and associates knowledge endlessly toward something else. That is, the character of knowledge, the austere, entry-worthy, epigrammatic, stoic personality of knowledge, cracks, and you wind up with memes using Family Guy, decadent low culture, to describe the subatomic behavior of hydrogen. This development mirrors the relationship between physics and the black hole, but in the case of memes, the implication that all knowledge has a personality, is sentient and responsive, places a soul in every piece of information. This massive living medium can only be contained by the concept of animism, which, as it is known in past cultures, would seem to break down our nature-technology division. But I believe our new animism relates parasitically to this divide and requires it in the manner of any counter-ideal. The narrative of the Internet, which I have put off declaring, now seems clear. The Internet is the story of the nomadic life of knowledge, deterritorialized or dissociated, or rather associated, constantly towards something else. But as I declare the primacy of this narrative, I allow it to fall in toward the absent singularity of association, where it is transferred again, and entirely. The utility of decadence. The sacrifice of singularity to pluralities that live on an infinite domain is a mark of decadence. The scale of this reversal required nothing less than the Internet, which is the largest public works project ever undertaken. Furthermore, the state of technology needed to render the web is so advanced, it could only have happened in concert with the delirious expansion of a quality of life incommensurate with the resources of the earth. Attempts to comprehend the situation produce vertigo that burns out, falls, and welcomes the inertia of nihilism, if such attempts have a singular goal in mind. The question in a decadent era, seeking to bring an end to its exhaustion, must be, what is the purpose of decadence? Yet to achieve comfort in such a time, one must defer this question as long as one can, heroically in the case of dandies. But if it were possible to give up parameters of this question, and observe the qualities of decadence as if observing a loved one, whose soul is very plain on their skin, like a quiet hue, an aura, would it be possible instead to ask, what is the auratic effect of decadence? As I perceive it, the soul of decadence is the color of doom. If our lifestyle could be condensed into a single coin, it would be token for an oracle, and her clairvoyance would be collective. We are all able to see the death of our species, like a black star immobile, burning through the horizon of our image of ourselves, coming to meet us with destruction. But whether it is a destruction of the possibility of life or of this image is unclear, and that lack of clarity must be cared for, though it is suspended by decadence, because it contains the possibility of survival in a new form. I said earlier that climate change, the millenarian cry of ecology, is the counter-ideal of neoliberalism. The death of this ideal has a life in the auratic conception of decadence. The fruits of its association are immense and proper to feed the ambiguity of doom. For the paradise of the Internet is futurity on earth, and futurity is the counter-ideal of doom.